He had the mansion, he had the money, he had the empire. By 1983, Tony Montana had built something that most men only dream about in desperate, quiet moments when the world feels too small for what they believe they deserve. A palace in Miami. An operation that stretched across 2 continents. A name that made rooms go silent and men go careful. He had taken nothing, an immigration detention facility, a pair of hands, and a fury that never really quieted down, and turned it into everything. And on the night everything almost collapsed. On the night the walls started closing in from every direction at once. Tony Montana learned something that no amount of money can teach you, and no amount of power can protect you from. He learned that the most dangerous enemy in the world is not the one standing across from you with a gun. It is not the cartel. It is not the federal agent building a case in a quiet office somewhere. It is not even the men you trusted who decided trust was too expensive to keep. The most dangerous enemy in the world is the one living inside your own head. And by that point, Tony Montana had been feeding that enemy for years without knowing it. This is the story of that night. But to understand that night, you have to understand what Tony Montana was before it happened. You have to understand what he wanted, what he built, and most importantly, what he became when he finally got everything he thought he needed. Because the man who came to Miami in 1980 and the man who sat behind that enormous desk in 1983 were not the same man. The first one was hungry. The second one was full in all the wrong ways, and starving in ways he could not name. Tony Montana arrived in Miami with nothing that the world would have recognized as power. He had a reputation from the streets of Havana that meant nothing in Florida. He had a criminal record that got him processed through a detention facility at a place called Freedom Town, a name so ironic it almost seems invented. He had a friend named Manny who believed in him, and he had a quality that would define everything that came after. He had an absolute, total, unshakable refusal to accept the position the world wanted to put him in. He was not going to wash dishes. He was not going to be small. The world had a specific slot for men who arrived the way Tony arrived, poor, foreign, brown, speaking accented English, carrying nothing. The world expected them to be grateful for that slot. Tony Montana was not grateful. Tony Montana looked at that slot and felt something very close to rage. That rage was not an accident. That rage had an address. And the address was years of watching other people own things that you believed you deserved. Years of understanding that the distance between where you were and where you wanted to be was not talent, not intelligence, not character. It was access. It was connection. It was the specific accident of birth that determines whether you start the race at the beginning or whether you start it 3 miles back, already tired, already behind, already being told to be reasonable about your expectations. Tony Montana had been told to be reasonable. He had decided not to be. What made Tony different from 1,000 other men who felt that same rage and that same refusal was not his ambition. Ambition is cheap. Ambition is everywhere. What made Tony different was his willingness to walk directly toward the thing that frightened everyone else. When Frank Lopez, the man who gave Tony his first real foothold in the Miami drug trade, needed someone to handle Emilio Rebenga in the detention facility, he needed someone who would do something terrifying in plain sight and walk away from it. Tony did it. Not because he was not afraid, but because he had decided that fear was a cost he was willing to pay for the life he wanted. Every other man in that moment would have found a reason to hesitate. Tony did not hesitate. That willingness, that specific quality of moving forward when everything in the nervous system is screaming to stop. That was the engine of everything that came after. He moved up quickly. He proved himself to Frank Lopez. He learned the business. He took note of who had power and how they held it and what it would take to get it. And then, in a moment that told you everything you needed to know about Tony Montana, he looked at Frank Lopez, the man who had given him his start, the man who had brought him in, and he decided that Frank Lopez was not the ceiling. Frank Lopez was just another step. Tony Montana did not feel gratitude the way other men feel it. He felt it briefly, acknowledged it, and then filed it away in the category of things that had already served their purpose. By the time he had Alejandro Sosa as a contact, by the time he had displaced Frank Lopez entirely, by the time he had Elvira on his arm and a mansion that looked like it had been designed by someone who had been told to imagine the maximum possible version of wealth, Tony Montana had achieved something remarkable. He had built an empire from almost nothing in roughly 3 years. That is a staggering accomplishment by any measure. And it destroyed him. Here is the thing about getting everything you wanted. The wanting was the engine. The hunger was the fuel. The anger at not having, the refusal to accept scarcity. The drive that came from watching other people own things you deserved. All of that was the machinery that made Tony Montana dangerous and brilliant and capable of building what he built. And when he had the mansion and the money and the name, the machinery did not stop. It could not stop. He did not know how to stop it. The only thing Tony Montana knew how to do was push forward. He had never learned how to stand still and hold what he had. Standing still felt like going backwards. Going backwards felt like death, so he pushed forward. And pushing forward, when you are already at the top of a structure you have built by bending every rule and terrifying every person who stood between you and what you wanted, does not make the structure stronger. It makes the cracks wider. The night everything almost collapsed did not begin with a threat from outside. It began inside Tony Montana's own head. It began in the paranoia that had been growing for months. The kind of paranoia that is not irrational when you are actually in danger, but that becomes devastating when it starts targeting the people who are not your enemies. Tony had survived to the point he had reached by being suspicious of everyone. Suspicion was a survival tool. It had kept him alive in situations where trusting the wrong person would have been fatal. But a tool that keeps you alive when the danger is real becomes a poison when it starts manufacturing danger where none exists. He was seeing threats everywhere. In the federal agents building their case, yes, that threat was real. In the cartel partners who were watching his moves and calculating their own, yes, that threat was real too. But also in the people around him, in the ones who had been with him since the beginning, in Manny, in Elvira, in the people whose loyalty he had earned, and then spent so much of himself trying to hold on to that he had gradually turned holding on into something that looked a lot like control. Elvira had left. That departure was not just a personal loss, though Tony experienced it as one. It was a symptom. It was the visible evidence of something that had been happening underneath the surface of everything for a long time. Tony Montana had achieved power, and then he had used that power the way a man uses anything when he is afraid of losing it. He had gripped it too hard. He had demanded from the people around him a kind of loyalty and a kind of closeness that was not really loyalty and was not really closeness. It was control wearing the costume of love. Elvira, who had her own intelligence and her own desires and her own sense of what her life was supposed to look like, could not live inside that control. She had told him so, directly, in language that anyone who was listening would have understood. Tony was not listening. Tony had been so deep inside his own version of events, so certain that what he was building and what he had and who he was constituted something worth staying for, that he could not hear what she was actually telling him. And so she left. And Tony, who had survived a detention center and a chainsaw, and the most powerful cartel in South America, could not process the departure of his wife without it becoming something that cracked the foundation of everything else. Because Tony Montana had made a strategic error that no amount of street intelligence could have warned him about. He had built his empire on the outside and left the inside completely unattended. He had a mansion that was a monument. He had an operation that worked. He had a reputation that made men careful when they said his name. And he had nothing, absolutely nothing, holding him together on the inside. No real friendships. Because real friendship requires you to be vulnerable, and Tony Montana had decided very early that vulnerability was the same thing as weakness. No peace. Because peace requires you to believe that what you have is enough, and Tony Montana's entire machinery was built on the conviction that enough did not exist. No sense of who he was outside of what he owned and what he controlled. Because he had defined himself entirely in those terms, and when those terms start to shift, when the empire starts to develop cracks, there is no other Tony Montana to fall back on. The federal case was building. He knew about it. He had known about it for a while. And, in any rational calculation, a man in Tony Montana's position with the resources Tony had available would have found a way to manage that threat. Would have found the right person to pay, or the right way to make evidence disappear, or at the very least would have started planning an exit. Tony had the money to disappear. He had the contacts. He had options that most men in his position would have used without a second thought. He did not use them. He stayed. He stayed because leaving would have felt like losing, and Tony Montana could not lose. Not because losing would have cost him his freedom, though it would have. Not because losing would have cost him his money, though it would have. But because losing would have required him to admit that the version of himself he had constructed, the man who started from nothing and took everything he wanted, was not quite real, was not quite solid, was built on something that could crack. So he stayed. And the night everything almost collapsed found him sitting behind that desk, cocaine spreading its particular kind of false clarity across his thinking, the paranoia louder than it had ever been, the federal case tightening, the cartel watching and waiting, and underneath all of it, underneath the noise and the drugs and the fury, something that Tony Montana had never once in his life sat still long enough to examine. Something that looked, if you could see it clearly, remarkably like grief. He was grieving the version of himself he had believed in, the one who was going to get everything and be happy when he got it, the one who was going to prove something to every person and every system that had ever told him to be small. He had gotten everything. He had proved whatever he set out to prove, and none of it had delivered what he thought it would. The mansion was just rooms. The money was just numbers. The name that made men careful was just a name. None of it had touched the thing underneath. The wound that had been there from the beginning, the thing that drove the machine. Nothing had healed it. Everything he had built had been built on top of it, and the weight was starting to show. What happened that night was not simply a physical confrontation. What happened that night was Tony Montana meeting the consequences of every choice he had made, not the choices that the law cared about, but the choices that the human interior keeps its own accounts on. The choice to define himself entirely by what he owned. The choice to mistake control for love. The choice to push forward when what the moment needed was for him to stop and reckon with what he had already lost. The choice to pour cocaine into the space where self-understanding was supposed to live. Every one of those choices had been made for understandable reasons. Every one of them made sense in the context of who Tony was, and where he came from and what he had decided, very early and very definitively, that the world owed him and what he owed the world back. But choices accumulate. They accrue interest. And on that night, Tony Montana was collecting on everything he had borrowed from himself over years of not looking at what he was doing to the inside, while he was so furiously building the outside. What it reveals about power is this: power of the kind Tony Montana built is real. It does things. It moves things. It makes certain things possible that are not possible without it. But power of that kind requires a foundation, and the foundation cannot be the need to prove something, or the fear of going back to nothing, or the rage of having started from a position the world decided for you. Those things can launch you. They cannot sustain you. They are rocket fuel. You can use rocket fuel to escape gravity. You cannot use it to keep yourself warm. The men who hold power for a long time, the ones who build something and actually manage to keep it, are the ones who at some point separate themselves from the thing they have built. Who can look at the empire and see it as something outside themselves, something that can be lost or changed or handed over without it meaning that they themselves have ceased to exist? Tony Montana could never do that. Tony Montana and his empire were the same thing, which meant that when the empire started to fall, Tony fell with it, because there was no Tony Montana who existed separately from the mansion and the money and the name. He had never built that person. He had been too busy building everything else. The most dangerous enemy is not outside. That is the lesson, and it is a brutal one, because it means that the thing you need to face is the thing you are most committed to not looking at. Tony Montana spent his entire extraordinary life looking outward, looking at what other people had that he deserved, looking at what obstacles stood between him and what he wanted, looking at threats and opportunities and enemies and allies. He was remarkable at reading the external world. He was almost completely blind to the internal one. And the internal one does not wait forever. The internal one eventually finds a way to make itself heard. In Tony Montana's case, it made itself heard in the loudest, most irreversible way possible. There is a version of Tony Montana that survives. It requires him to have done the one thing his entire nature fought against: to stop, to look inward, to ask himself what he actually wanted and why. All. And whether what he was doing was getting him closer to it, or whether the machine he had built had long since stopped serving him and was now simply running on its own momentum, carrying him forward not because forward was where he needed to go, but because stopping was the one thing he did not know how to do. That version of Tony never existed. But thinking about it tells you something real about the nature of power and ambition, and what happens when a person is consumed entirely by the external project of their own life, and never attends to the internal one. He had the mansion. He had the money. He had the empire. He had built himself into the most visible, most powerful, most recognizable version of everything he had been told he could not be. And somewhere underneath all of it, in the part of himself he had been moving too fast to notice for years, he was still that person standing at the beginning, still hungry, still trying to prove something, still not sure what exactly would make the proving feel like enough. Because that part of him had never grown up, had never been fed, had never been given anything to grow on. The empire was real. The man underneath the empire was still a 22-year-old standing outside the gates of everything he wanted, furious and afraid and absolutely certain that if he could just get inside, everything would change. It did not change. And on the night everything almost collapsed, with the walls coming in from every direction and the cocaine burning through his system, and the empire cracking at every joint, Tony Montana was finally unavoidably standing alone with the thing he had been running from the entire time. Himself, not the name, Not the power, not the man that the mansion and the money had built. The actual, original, human person underneath all of it. The one who had come to Miami with nothing but rage and refusal and an absolute conviction that he deserved something better than what the world had given him. He was right about that. He did deserve better. But he spent every ounce of himself proving it in the wrong direction. Building outward instead of inward. Taking instead of building. Controlling instead of connecting. And the night everything almost collapsed was the night the bill came due for all of it. Every choice. Every shortcut. Every moment he had chosen the external over the internal, the acquisition over the understanding, the power over the peace. This is what power looks like when it is built on the wrong foundation. It is real. It is impressive. It is, for a while, genuinely extraordinary. And it does not last, not because the external world tears it down, though the external world will always eventually try. But because the internal world, the world that was there before the empire and will be there after it, does not wait. Does not get bought off. Does not get intimidated. The internal world collects what it is owed. And Tony Montana, who could outwit cartels and outmaneuver federal agents, and build an empire from a detention facility, and a pair of hands and a fury that never quieted, could not outwit himself. No one can. That is the only fight you cannot win by being harder or faster or more willing to do what the other person is not. That is the fight that requires something else entirely. Something Tony Montana, in all his ferocious and genuinely remarkable life, never found the time to build. He had the mansion. He had the money. He had the empire. He had everything except the one thing that would have let him keep any of it. He never knew his own name. Not the one everyone in Miami was careful about. The one underneath. And on the night everything almost collapsed. In the loudest and most irreversible way, he found out why that was the only one that mattered.